So, how many of you are attending your first ICANN meeting? So I'm going to give you the best piece of advice that you will ever get at an ICANN meeting. When you speak, and you should speak, say your name and say it clearly. As people who attend ICANN know and attend the IGF know, my comments are never attributed to woman speaking. The transcription is intelligent software, and you have to wake it up. And you need to say your name slowly and clearly, and look at the transcript to make sure your name is properly represented. It's important for your voice to be heard, and that's one of the things we're going to talk about in this session. But one of the things that I watch is why woman speaking and man speaking are dominating the public forums. It's because you're not getting your name out there. So that's my advice to you as newcomers to ICANN. When you take the microphone, say your name and say it slowly and clearly, because the software will begin to recognize it. It's my best tip for you to make yourself known and effective at ICANN. So, as some of the people here know, I've been around since the goddess invented the internet.
That was the goddess Al Gore.
It's Women Recognition Day today. So let's skip ahead to the answer to this question. Is internet governance applicable to everyone? The answer is yes. So now we can go to Q&A, right? But actually I'm going to say just a few more things, if I can figure out my magic clicker. So I've been lecturing on internet governance now for something like so many years I probably don't want to think about it. I used to lecture at something called the United States Telecommunications and Technology and Telecommunications Institute, which typically brought about 30 to 40 representatives from the government and primarily ISPs and engineers to Washington, D.C. on a very elaborate training program. And there are heads of regulatory authorities, there are deputy ministers, there are system engineers. It's not really something that focuses on bringing business people, but very often there will be academics as well who attend. And so I've had to think about how to explain internet governance in a multicultural, multi-language environment where policymakers are expert in what they were elected to do, not in the technology. So I like to use the parable of the 9 blind men and the elephant, and there are various versions of this parable out there, but the one I use most frequently is the story about the Maharaja in a rural province in India who had 9 sages and advisors, all of whom were cyclists. And every morning when he would get up to watch the sun and enjoy the flowers, he would hear the chattering and arguing among his sages. What is an elephant? What does an elephant do? What does an elephant look like? And he finally became very disgusted with this, and he recruited a small group of young boys to escort the sages into the forest and find an elephant. And they circled the elephant and began to feel of it. And then they came back and they stood in his courtyard and advised him on what an elephant is. An elephant is like a boulder, because that sage was touching the side of the elephant. An elephant is like a snake, because that sage was touching the trunk. An elephant is a fan. It cooled me as I stood beside it, because it was the ear. So at the end of the day, the Maharaja decided perhaps it wasn't so important that they have a unified view of the elephant, but that they better understand the part of the elephant that they were experiencing. Internet governance is very much like that. It is not an amalgamation of everything coming together into a single place. In the view of the world that I hold, and I will just say to the comment that was made, I spent 10 years in state government. And then I, of course, had the perfect training to move into the high-tech sector. A master's degree in social work and organizational development. I say that because I heard some comments earlier from some folks here who are thinking about what they're going to study in order to move into an area of policy that they're interested in. And there is no single path to that, just as there's no single path to the right answer about internet governance and the role that you might decide to play wherever you are. So you've already seen, I think yesterday, Judith probably, and also Olivier probably referred to this definition of internet governance, which was developed by a multi-stakeholder group appointed by the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. We actually were very, very lucky that Kofi Annan was the Secretary General in the period of time when the World Summit on the Information Society was being established. The father of the internet in Africa, Nikwenar, was an advisor to Kofi Annan. Kofi was from Ghana, as many of you, if you've done your history work, know. And we're very fortunate that we had this path to the Secretary General of the UN. Governments were sitting in rooms talking about the World Summit on the Information Society, information and ICT for all. They devolved into a big debate about whether ICANN was governing the internet or how people were going to get access. They were sitting in rooms talking with no expert advisors with them, because for many of them, they were not able to bring experts from their country with them. And so they were talking about changes in technology and innovation without the kind of support or expertise they needed. It took us a year and a half to get access to the room. So governments would meet, and probably my biggest marketing job was convincing my boss that I needed to be able to fly to Geneva, Switzerland, and hang out in the coffee shop to have coffee with various government negotiators, since we weren't allowed in the room. By the end of the World Summit, the stakeholders were allowed in the room, and that's an important thing to think about. We've been on a very long journey, and we're really only beginning, and I think Milton's focus on cybersecurity and some of the comments you heard yesterday are a really good example to you to think about. Is internet governance important to everybody? What part of it is important to me, to my family, to my country, to my daily life, to my job? So you probably saw this yesterday in Olivier's presentation. We had no idea where the internet would go. This is one of the images that you can find on the internet of a single second snapshot that portrays the traffic on the internet at a point in time. There are many others out there. The algorithm that is used for this was developed by William Cheswick from AT&T Labs. He has some work that I would, if you're interested in the implications of traffic and how traffic is changing, I would recommend to you Bill's work. He's still writing and publishing. The internet traffic, when we first started out, email traffic barely appears on the internet, and yet email is one of the most frequently used applications for the average user in order to conduct their daily life, to conduct their work. Of course, social networks as well, but we have to remember that the internet underlying infrastructure is having to change dramatically to keep up with the changes in traffic. So what's the single greatest contributor to traffic today on what we call the internet?
Video streaming.
When we moved to the ability for average individuals to stream video, to exchange videos with each other, to send photos, and we augmented the capability of the devices to support that, we put huge, huge demands on the infrastructure that underpins the routing of traffic. And it's something that, you know, if you're a policymaker and you're in a position of thinking about what are the rules, codes, standards, regulations that are affecting access to content, access to information, access to services, and you're aware of how ICTs and innovation are dramatically changing the delivery of applications like healthcare, like banking, like agriculture, then you have to start thinking about, are the rules we have in place today barriers to integrating those kinds of uses into the internet? And are we actually prepared for this thoroughly digitized world from the standpoint of digital literacy, from the standpoint of understanding the individual's role in their own security and privacy online? So I think you probably saw a version of this from maybe Olivia yesterday. Diplo does some very interesting graphics and kind of cartoon explanations of technology. They have a series for diplomats, which I did a course with them for diplomats about 5 years ago, where we invited diplomats to Malta, we invited diplomats to Brussels, we invited diplomats to the United Nations. And one of the most remarkable things that I heard, because I was trying to persuade senior ambassadors at the UN. So the UN agencies, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, but the technical agencies are primarily housed in Geneva. The political agencies and focus are represented at the UN in New York. And it's a very, very different environment. When working with the, I see our colleague who is a youth ambassador nodding, it's a very different environment when you go to New York and are engaging with ambassadors than when you are working with the more technically oriented teams that are housed in Geneva at the various agencies. So we went to New York, and the event was co-hosted by the ambassador from Malta and the ambassador from Switzerland. And Jovan and I had been struggling with how we were going to explain internet governance to these ambassadors who probably had just, some of them have just walked out of a Security Council meeting where they were raising their voices with each other or arguing about whether Palestine was going to be recognized. And then they're coming into the session where we're going to explain internet governance. So the minister from Malta, who had traveled from Malta, explained internet governance as an e-diplomacy tool. So when we think about who's involved in internet governance, or who should be, I can't put enough little boxes and circles on a single sheet of paper, in my view. But on the left-hand side, that's some of the government organizations and international organizations. Increasingly, I believe that national governments and national agencies have to be involved and knowledgeable about internet governance and not delegate to the centralized expert agencies of the UN. When we were debating and business was first deciding whether or not internet governance mattered to them, whether or not the World Summit on the Information Society mattered, I can name the 7 people from business who consistently paid attention to the World Summit on the Information Society. Because business typically is running their business. So I was quoted, unfortunately, on saying, why should the UN be involved in the internet? After all, they've done so well with world peace and clean water. That might not have been my most diplomatic moment. The technical and business groups, typically business delegates representation on policy issues to professional organizations and trade associations. Only large companies have the resources to work with dedicated staff at places like the ITU or at UNESCO or elsewhere. For the most part, business aggregates their points of view. You're all familiar here in Puerto Rico, you know you have a very strong Chamber of Commerce. You have a very effective Rotary International Club. You have a number of professional groups. So that's business around the world. You see representatives from the policy teams at Google or AT&T, where I used to work, or Microsoft coming to these various meetings. But what you don't see are the SMEs from countries, because small and mid-sized businesses are at home running their business. And one of the biggest challenges, which is why I primarily work with ICT associations from developing countries to help them be more effective with their government representatives who are participating in the international forum. On the right-hand side, and I can't name all of the really effective and wonderful NGOs and civil society groups or individual activists, but on the right-hand side, I've just listed a few examples, including the fact that academics, when we founded ICANN, there was a group called Internet 2, and still working, and EDUCAUSE and EDUCOM, who represented the CIOs and CTOs of the major universities, who were very, very involved in working together to set ICANN up. So it wasn't always an academic who, like Milton, was working in a particular area of policy, but in many cases it was somebody from the operational side of the university. I can't list all the issues. When we launched the IGF, we focused on about 5 or 6 issues. The issues continue to evolve and to diversify, and they are changing considerably because of digitization and the fact that your daily life and your business life is heavily affected by whether or not you have access, whether or not you're digitally competent, whether or not there's content of meaning for you, whether you can read the content, because so 300 million women in the world are totally illiterate. So what does that mean about how their access to the online world has to look? Can't be text-based. Needs to be video or audio with interpretation, right? We have to start thinking about what the policies are, and that means citizens have to start thinking about the policies. We have to start thinking about why we are doing things or not doing things in terms of investments. So just to give you an example, because you're living with it here in Puerto Rico, hardened infrastructure is incredibly important everywhere in the world. You guys just experienced what Mother Nature can do through the force of wind and water to destroy the stability of things that you count on, including electrical power, including the ability to keep people safe in a hospital and to care for them. So, you know, in thinking about does internet governance, is it internet governance? And what is internet governance? Well, I like to think of internet governance as an umbrella term that a lot of issues then can be worked on. I'm also not a big fan of the idea that there's a one-size-fits-all for multi-stakeholder engagement. Sam and I were just talking earlier. We both have done some engagement at the ITU. He as a government representative, and myself as a business representative. And the engagement in expert agencies of the United Nations, whether it's UNESCO, or it's the ITU, or it's WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, or it's ILO. ILO is a little different because the three sectors do sit on an equal footing: government, labor, and business. But no single space, other than the IGF, is multi-stakeholder on an equal footing, the Internet Governance Forum. Even at ICANN, we have advisory committees, and we have constituencies, and we have the board. So it is a model of multi-stakeholder engagement, but it's not the only model, nor should it be. We create binding policies at ICANN, and those are delivered through contracts with the contracted parties, and ICANN is responsible for enforcing them. We also provide a shelter to the contracted parties from having to get authorizations or regulation approval levels in each country. A couple of people yesterday said they run ISPs. You're in Canada, and you're in the US. Is there somebody here from an ISP from another country? In most countries, when you enter the market, both Canada and the US are much more liberal. You get a business license, but in most other countries, you have to get an authorization, pay a fee, hire a lawyer. If registries and registrars that are accredited by ICANN and have contractual agreements with ICANN had to do that country by country, think about how different the internet would look like. It would be very fragmented. By the way, the term fragmentation is much improved. You know, we used to call it balkanization. Very politically incorrect. So I have I spent the early part of my tech career at AT&T in helping to found AT&T Computer Systems and AT&T WorldNet. And I was very lucky because AT&T Labs wouldn't let me out unsupervised, which is always a good thing. Don't laugh, Nelson. When we tried to introduce the internet in the United States as AT&T WorldNet, we came up with this idea of teaching elected members of Congress about how to use email to communicate with their constituents back home and their offices back home. And that's all it was at first. Literally, a coalition of businesses went to the Hill and trained the staff of members of Congress one by one by one to use the internet. They were faced with making laws about the internet. When we created ICANN, and there are people in this room who contributed to it, Milton, myself, Olivier, others, how many million users were there on the internet in 1998? And Olivier, Judith, and Milton can't answer. 1998, when we created ICANN. 147 million. How many users were there on the internet in 2005 in Tunis at the second phase of the summit? 2005. 1.1 billion. So where are we today? Well, 2 days ago when I started my presentation, we were at 3.6 billion. Today we're at close to 3.7 billion. The internet is growing rapidly, but 40% of the world has access to the internet. When mobile operators tell you that they're connecting the world to the internet, you should not buy into that. A smart device may allow you to access content. It does not allow you to be a creator. Mobile-to-mobile traffic is growing dramatically, and I'm not disparaging mobile. Believe me, I contribute to the average number of mobile devices that you have. When my house burned up recently, my laptop, my iPhone, and my iPad were destroyed, and the first thing I did was go replace my electronics before I even had a place to stay. So there's something wrong with people like me. So policymakers are elected because they're going to build better roads. They're going to bring jobs. They're going to reform health care. They're committed to changing the education system. And then we assign them responsibility of creating laws, regulatory models, for governing technology and innovation. When people today say the internet, they actually mean the online world. They are thinking in their head about the websites they access, the social media they use. But as Milton said, that underlying connectivity that the internet brings is what has really brought many of us together. So, let's spend a few minutes on your views about, does the internet matter to everyone? And what should you as a citizen be thinking about in terms of your role in internet governance? You've come to this course, you're going to go to the ICANN meeting, okay? You've got your foot in one part of the internet ecosystem. But what about your role as a citizen?
Hi, my name is Varsha Thurel, and I'm a lawyer. I work for government, but I'm here in my personal capacity, and I'm a doctoral student. So my topic, which is my passion, to answer your question, is that I believe that ICTs are a formidable avenue to development. So what I'm writing about is how ICTs and a proper regulatory model coupled with multi-stakeholderism, which will be my proposal, can assist emerging economies in developing their GDP and creating better development for marginalized communities. As you rightly pointed out, only 40% of the world have access. So my passion is the 60%. So I believe there's a massive role to play, especially in developing countries. And that is what has been excluded. So I feel that my participation here and the exposure that I'm trying to glean from this experience to take back to my country and also in my recommendations on my doctorate will relate to some sort of multi-stakeholder model, because I can't see how government alone can navigate this path. So that is, and that's why I'm going to talk to you later on. You can bet on it.
So one of the things I kind of skipped over at the bottom, and you guys will get my slides, and I'll add one. Olivier asked me to add my example of the internet governance meetings, or Marilyn Cade's scary travel schedule, which some of you have seen, which is something around 30 to 40 meetings. It doesn't even touch on the number of meetings that are actually taking place. But one of the things I want to mention to all of you is the growth of the national and regional IGFs. The IGF was launched based on the Tunis agenda. It takes place annually, but spontaneously with no mandate. National IGFs initiatives have begun to emerge. And I mentioned that I was the chief catalyst of the IGF. Judith is also a member of the steering group of the IGF USA. Olivier is on the board of the Eurodig. Several others here are very actively involved. At that national activity level, you can really make a difference. So here's an example. The Nigerian IGF met 2 months before the plenipotentiary, the ITU plenipotentiary. And there was a new minister who came from the private sector. The preparation for the ITU plenipotentiary is owned by the regulatory authority, not by the Minister of Communications in Nigeria. The participants in the Nigerian IGF invited the new minister to change the delegation attending the IGF to multi-stakeholder. It went from 70 people to 115, and even exceeded the number of the U.S. government's delegation, which is usually the largest. Now, the IGF, the national IGF, writes recommendations on policy changes that are needed in Nigeria and debates them and presents them to the minister. And there is a commitment that the minister will convene meetings throughout the year and give feedback on progress that is addressing the major concerns. One more, and then I'm going to go to somebody else, okay?
I'm really sorry about that. I think that one of the problems that you find in government is that the exposure level is so minimal. And now these are our policymakers, which is why I believe the multi-stakeholder model has so many benefits. Because there has to be, different, a bird's eye view of the entire scene. And that is often excluded. And government officials are not privy to the other side. And they need to have some sort of global view, which they don't have. And if these are policymakers, we have challenges. And this is why there are so many problems.
So I have two ideas for you. One, in order to get invited to an ICANN meeting, if you are a government person invited to the GAC, you often need an invitation. There are 3 members of the GAC, I'm not going to tell you the governments, who were not involved in, I'll tell you one, we're not involved in the ICANN GAC at all. And during the business one, I became very good friends with the representative from Sri Lanka, who was the ICT policy advisor to the Prime Minister, Jayantha Fernanda. And Sri Lanka had never come to an ICANN meeting. It took me a year and a half to get an invitation because at that time, ICANN hadn't figured out that government rules are very different. Jayantha went on to be vice chair of the GAC. There are 2 other government officials that I met at ITU meetings who were very interested in participating in ICANN, but they didn't have the path, and their boss was not particularly interested. The second tip I'm going to give you is that using the IGF itself, the Internet Governance Forum itself, as an access point to engage with your governments, both at a national level but at a global level, is a very effective tool. So later during the ICANN meeting, you will hear Anya Genko tomorrow, the focal point for the NRIs, is speaking on one of your panels. And I convene the national and regional IGFs at all of the ICANN meetings. So for those of you who are interested, if you know that you have a national IGF, good. If you don't know, Anya and I know who to connect you with. What other questions do we have? Because I want to go back to this citizen issue of, do you talk to your elected policymakers? And if so, how do you get their ear? Let me go over here and then come to you, okay?
All the way in the corner here. So I think this is actually, I'm really glad you brought up this talking with our policymakers, because this is a work that needs to be done. There's a lot of work in a variety of different disciplines that look at the digital skills gaps. But when we're thinking about understanding how people understand themselves in internet governance, we don't really have a mechanism yet that's able to capture it. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, what are some things that we could measure as sort of civic knowledge around internet governance that might be beneficial to communicating with our elected representatives or people who are representing us in internet governance spaces as a way to sort of educate publics about internet governance? What are some areas, issue areas that we can do better, sort of like digital literacy skills around internet governance? I'm interested in hearing your opinion.
So, are your grandparents still living? Somebody who here has a grandparent? You do. Would your grandparents feel comfortable learning about the new technology, or would they prefer that perhaps you coach them on it? Think of most elected policymakers as being like your grandparents. And I don't mean that negatively, but literally, if you were elected because you are an educator or because you're a doctor. Now, if you're a doctor today, you're probably heavily immersed in understanding how technology and research is being applied to medical care, right? But think about the fact that most policymakers, particularly in rural parts of developing countries, the clay roads in Kenya are plowed twice a year right before the elected member of the parliament goes home. People still ride bikes and walk for miles to go to school. So what are you going to talk to that policymaker about? The fact that affordability of access is absolutely critical. The fact that it's not enough to have text-based information in a country that has hundreds of dialects and a heavily illiterate female community. In the northern part of Nigeria, women are not allowed to work outside the home because of safety issues, Boko Haram, etc. So what are you going to do if you're a policymaker to bring education to girls and women in their village? Because it's not acceptable for girls in Afghanistan to participate in post-school activities because it's not considered culturally acceptable or safe. So there's a set of centers in Afghanistan that are staffed, and they have computers, and they have coaches. Guess what? There's one entrance. You know what that means? Women and girls can't enter. So what do you do then? Well, you put in two separate entrances. If you're a policymaker, you got to think about the culture that you're bringing the digitized world into, and talk to them about how they can use their role as a policymaker, a parliamentarian, somebody who is helping to advance technology, to customize it to your culture. Let me take one last question, and then I think you need to wrap up.
So I work with SDGs and NGOs,
And what, I'm sorry, what are SDGs?
sustainability issues.
Sustainable Development Goals.
Yes. Okay. So one of the things that I deal with is the youth assembly recently happened, and we were talking about blockchain. Just to give you a little bit of background and make it really fast, just a controversy that happened in third world countries. I deal a lot with apparel manufacturers and also other types of certification in the manufacturing world. The Rainforest Alliance certificate had a little bit of a controversy. We had a situation with child labor laws, and basically the certification would mean that your cocoa, right, in your product would be transparent, so you would know where it came from and you would know that it was sustainable. What an investigation found out is that it wasn't. No one could actually find out where the actually beans were coming from. With that being said, this also type of sourcing happens in the manufacturing world. We're all wearing clothing today, and I think that there's something that we need to think about is at what price markup that you guys buy your clothing that you adore, and who are the people behind it that are making it. I'm dealing with blockchain, and I'm trying to bring the new generation into understanding blockchain as much as the older generation. I'm a year in the United Nations, and I feel in many ways I am a loose cannon, because it's quite difficult for me to talk in a diplomatic way when things aren't moving. What would you suggest?
So in Geneva, where the technical agencies are, the average number of staff at a mission is what? You don't get to answer that. So the average mission of the 191 governments that have missions in Geneva, what's the average number of staff? And what's the total number of the UN agencies they have to cover? 27 to 36. And one of those three is the ambassador. New York is slightly better staffed, and there will be somebody who has responsibility for the second committee. So one thing that I would suggest is, and let's talk later, but one thing that I would suggest is there is this, this side event activity that can be scheduled, but you need to have a senior ambassador act as the host and send the invitations and get the room and invite people. But let's talk later, because we have done some things like that, not nearly enough. But then it has to be not a tutorial on blockchain. It has to be, how is blockchain going to solve this problem in your country? Guys, thanks for your time. I am the easiest person to find at ICANN, I'm told.